As you know from our earlier discussion, the Federal Reserve wanted demand to rise rapidly before 1980 in order to keep the economy robust. Unfortunately, that led to rising inflation. Rising inflation, in turn, led over time to rising interest rates. In August of 1979, President Carter appointed Paul Volcker chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. And Mr. Volcker resolved to bring inflation back down. He had his opportunity in 1981. And in 1981, Mr. Volcker instituted, with the approval of the board, a drastic restrictive and contractionary policy. And that contractionary policy drove interest rates north. And you can see by looking at chart 6.1, as I'm doing now, that the federal funds rate rose to almost 20%. And all other interest rates rose proportionally. For instance, mortgage interest rates were about 18%. Automobile loan rates were about 25%. The prime rate, which is the rate banks charge their best customers, about 21%. And so those high interest rates shrunk borrowing, shrunk demand. The idea, of course, was by shrinking demand to shrink inflation. On the way, of course, it caused a horrible recession of 1981-82. If you look at chart 5.1, you can see, however, that the benefit was rapidly falling rate of inflation. And inflation has really remained moderate ever since. And because inflation has remained moderate ever since, if you turn to chart 6.1, you can see that interest rates have fallen ever since the year 1982. And they haven't fallen regularly. That is, they haven't fallen uninterruptedly. There have been spikes in interest rates every time the Federal Reserve felt that inflation was a renewed threat. The Federal Reserve saw to it that interest rates rose, and consequently, of course, interest rates rising dampened economic activity and prevented the surge of inflation. When we get up to the present day, of course, as we said, the Federal Reserve was set in its policy. Through historical example, the Federal Reserve was set, even though Paul Volcker was no longer the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He had stepped down in 1987. Alan Greenspan had taken his place. Alan Greenspan was the chair of the Fed in 1999, 2000, and so on, when the dot-com bubble burst. As you know from our earlier discussion, the Fed's policy was one of depressing interest rates as soon as the economy was threatened. And sure enough, that's what the Federal Reserve did in the year 2001, perfectly consistent with traditional Federal Reserve policy as a response to recession. There was no threat of inflation at the time, and so the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates and drove the economy forward. That led to the great asset inflation, the housing boom we talked about earlier. Now, you might say, but wait a minute. Isn't the Federal Reserve's job to fight inflation? Why didn't the Federal Reserve force interest rates upward in the midst of the housing inflation? Because the Federal Reserve traditionally did not look at asset prices. The Federal Reserve focused on the Consumer Price Index. Home prices, just like stock market prices, are not in the Consumer Price Index. And so the Federal Reserve did not focus on the asset inflation It focused on consumer price inflation. Since there was no consumer price inflation rampant in 2002, 2003, the Fed determined that interest rates could be kept low. Unfortunately, as we all know, it led to the asset inflation, the Great Bubble, and the pop. And the bursting of the bubble led to the crisis of 2008, 2009.